The silver Toyota Camry glided through the winding streets of Charleston, South Carolina, like a whisper threading between the city's storied colonial homes and moss-draped oaks. On a weathered brick wall near the old harbor, graffiti scrawled a haunting phrase: "The heart of a person always leans toward the eternal, and it's not time that sets the rhythm, but the light within." Behind the wheel, Father Thomas Matthew Callahan, a man of serene heart and clear-eyed purpose, gazed out toward the horizon, his face softened by an expression of gratitude. The warm hues of sunset painted the rooftops in shades of gold, and his chest swelled with emotion. "To weep over small things is a sign of a generous soul," he mused aloud, his voice tender, "for it sees beauty where others see nothing." The iconic St. Philip's Church awaited his arrival, but his spirit lingered in quiet communion with the unseen stories weaving the destinies of the people of Charleston. Father Callahan drove without hurry, his hands steady on the wheel, knowing deep in his heart that it wasn't time urging him forward, but a profound and abiding love, a love that called to him from the altar he would soon stand before. This wasn't just any ceremony. Today marked a pivotal moment for a young woman he had known since her very first breath. Margaret Ann Walker, now a radiant 24, had grown up under the watchful care of his congregation. From the day he baptized her as a newborn, she had been like a delicate flower, tended by invisible angels. Now she stood at the precipice of a new chapter, her wedding. It wasn't merely a union of two lives. It was the culmination of a love story that began when Margaret was just 16. The man waiting at the altar, James Robert Ellington III, 27, hailed from one of Charleston's most affluent families. James had been Margaret's first and only love, a devoted partner through years of courtship. Together, they embodied a romantic ideal that seemed destined for eternity. Yet, as the Camry rolled over the cobblestones, Father Callahan couldn't ignore the faint unease stirring within him. He glanced at the delicate gold cross hanging from his rearview mirror, and a whisper of doubt flickered like a candle's wavering flame. "The altar is sacred only when truth binds the souls united there," he reflected solemnly. "If shadows hide behind promises, the altar becomes a cage where love can never soar free." His musings were interrupted by the sharp glint of red ahead. On a lonely stretch of road curving around the Ashley River, a striking Ferrari Portofino sat still, gleaming like a misplaced jewel in the fading light. Father Callahan slowed instinctively, his trained eye noting the absence of movement. His pulse quickened as recognition set in. It was James's car. The priest's breath caught. "An unexpected breakdown," he murmured, trying to quell the unease in his chest. He rationalized it as a trivial inconvenience. Yet the stillness of the scene carried an almost imperceptible weight, an unspoken language only those attuned to silence might understand. Something felt off. Father Callahan parked his modest Camry a safe distance away and approached the sports car cautiously. The air seemed heavier here, tinged with the subtle tension of withheld breath. The windows of the Ferrari were tinted dark, concealing the interior. Pressing his hands to the cool glass, Father Callahan formed a small circle with his fingers to peer inside. What met his gaze was not mechanical trouble or a harmless accident. Instead, it was a truth that pierced through his soul with devastating clarity. Inside the car, James was locked in a passionate embrace with a woman who wasn't Margaret. His hands, which should have been awaiting sacred rings, caressed a face that wasn't meant to share his vows. Their lips, entwined in betrayal, paid no heed to the priest's silent presence outside. Father Callahan stumbled back, as if struck by an invisible force. The pain in his chest wasn't just from the shock of the betrayal, it was from the weight of the responsibility now thrust upon him. He could not, in good conscience, Allow this marriage to proceed." The priest returned to his car, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Turning onto a shortcut past the old Ravenel Bridge, he resolved to reach the church before the ceremony could begin. But as if the universe itself conspired against him, his engine sputtered and stalled. A wisp of smoke curled from under the hood, and Father Callahan realized, with bitter frustration, that he was stranded. Father Callahan stepped out of the car, his polished black shoes crunching against the loose gravel of the deserted road. He lifted the hood, revealing an engine that had succumbed to the heat of his urgency. Frustrated but determined, he retrieved his phone only to find that there was no signal. The isolation of the road mirrored his inner turmoil, a silence that pressed on him like the weight of his own conscience. Closing his eyes, he leaned against the car, his fingers gripping the cool metal of the hood as he whispered a desperate prayer. "Lord, grant me strength to act in truth, even when the path is fraught with darkness. Let me shield the innocent from the pain they do not yet see." As he stood in contemplation, the surrounding air felt eerily still, as though time itself held its breath. Moments later, a light breeze stirred the overhanging branches, carrying with it the faint scent of salt from the nearby marshes. The priest interpreted this as a sign, subtle, yet reassuring. He returned to the car, turned the key in the ignition, and, to his astonishment, the engine roared to life. Driving with renewed determination, Father Callahan arrived at St. Philip's just as the evening bells tolled, their solemn chime echoing through the historic streets. The towering spire of the church loomed over him as he parked, a silent sentinel to the truth he now bore. He entered the church through the grand oak doors, their ornate carvings depicting scenes of divine justice. Inside, the golden light of the setting sun filtered through stained glass windows, casting vibrant hues across the pews. Guests murmured softly, their conversations a delicate hum of anticipation. At the altar stood Margaret, resplendent in a gown of ivory lace, her youthful beauty magnified by an air of innocence. Her veil, draped lightly over her shoulders, seemed almost otherworldly as it caught the rays of light. Beside her, James stood tall, his tailored suit emphasizing the confidence he exuded. But Father Callahan saw past the polished exterior to the shadow lurking in his gaze, a shadow the priest could no longer ignore. The ceremony unfolded with reverence, each word and gesture steeped in tradition. Father Callahan's role as officiant required him to lead the couple through their vows, yet his voice faltered under the weight of what he knew. When the time came for the customary question, his heart raced. If anyone has any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever. Hold your peace. A tense silence filled the church, punctuated only by the soft rustle of fabric as the congregation shifted uncomfortably. Father Callahan's throat tightened. He had hoped for divine intervention, for some miraculous sign that would spare him the burden of revealing the truth. But none came. "I must speak," he said finally, his voice firm yet laced with sorrow. All heads turned in unison, eyes widening as the realization of his interruption dawned on the room. Margaret's gaze snapped to him, confusion etched across her delicate features. James froze, his body unnaturally rigid. "Margaret, James," Father Callahan began, stepping down from the altar to address them directly. His black cassock swayed slightly as he moved, the rustling fabric the only sound in the otherwise silent hall. "I cannot allow this union to proceed under the guise of truth when it is bound by deception." Gasps rippled through the crowd, their disbelief like waves crashing against the walls of the church. Margaret's face blanched, her gloved hands trembling as she gripped her bouquet. "Father, what are you saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The priest took a steadying breath, his gaze shifting between the bride and groom. "James," he said, his tone grave, "on my way here I saw you with another woman. I saw the betrayal that your actions have wrought on this day. a day meant to celebrate love and fidelity. The air in the church grew heavy, oppressive. James's face flushed a deep crimson, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to form words. "That's not true," he exclaimed, his voice rising with desperation. "You've misunderstood, Father. It's not what it seems." Father Callahan's sharp eyes met his, unwavering. "Do not compound your sin with lies," he said, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. "Your actions speak for themselves, and I cannot, in good conscience, stand silent while vows are exchanged under false pretenses." Margaret's bouquet slipped from her trembling hands, landing softly on the marble floor. Her wide eyes filled with tears as she turned to James, searching his face for some denial, some explanation that might undo the shattering revelation. "James," she pleaded, her voice cracking, "tell me this isn't true." James looked at her, his expression one of pure desperation. "Margaret, please, Anna," he said, his voice shaking. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but it doesn't mean I don't love you. You are my everything." Margaret's tears streamed down her face, her breathing ragged as she processed the betrayal. The congregation watched in stunned silence, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. "Love?" she echoed bitterly, her words like shards of glass. "Love doesn't betray. It doesn't falter the moment temptation whispers its lies. What you've done, it isn't love." James fell to his knees before her, his hands outstretched in supplication. "I swear to you, Margaret, I'll spend the rest of my life making this right. Just give me another chance." But Margaret shook her head, her expression one of profound sorrow. "How can I build a life with someone who has already torn it apart before it even began?" Her words resonated through the church, a declaration of her refusal to compromise her self-worth. Turning on her heel, she walked down the aisle, her veil billowing behind her like a specter of the life she was leaving behind. James called after her, but she didn't look back. Father Callahan stepped into James's path as he made to follow. His hand rested firmly on the young man's shoulder, his voice low and commanding. "Let her go," he said. "You chose to betray her trust. Now you must face the consequences of your actions." The church doors closed behind Margaret with a finality that echoed in the hearts of everyone present. The heavy oak doors of St. Philip's swung shut behind Margaret, sealing her departure from the life she had so carefully imagined. Her footsteps quickened as she fled the cobblestone street outside, tears blurring the gas lamp's gentle glow into streaks of golden light. The ivory lace of her wedding gown swished against her legs, a cruel reminder of the day's shattered dreams. When she reached her small family home on the outskirts of Charleston, she flung open the door, her breaths ragged. In the quiet of her childhood bedroom, she finally allowed herself to crumble. The wedding gown pooled at her feet as she slipped out of it, leaving it in a heap on the floor, a monument to what would never be. Margaret changed into simple jeans and a soft yellow blouse, her trembling hands brushing away the last remnants of tears. She stared at her reflection in the antique mirror, her once bright eyes now dimmed with pain. The delicate gold locket around her neck, a gift from James, felt heavy against her skin. With a single decisive motion, she unclasped it and placed it on the dresser. Her reflection seemed to challenge her, asking, "What now?" In her heart, Margaret knew the answer. She couldn't remain surrounded by the echoes of her broken engagement, of the life she had dreamed with James. Her soul cried out for distance, for clarity, for a fresh beginning. 2 days later, Margaret found herself seated on a plane, bound for Santa Barbara, California. The flight was originally meant to be her honeymoon, a romantic getaway James had meticulously planned. Now it would become something else entirely. Her retreat, her escape, her chance to rediscover who she was beyond the role of fiancée. As the plane descended over the rugged California coastline, Margaret gazed out the window at the Pacific Ocean, its vast expanse reflecting the sunlight in dazzling waves. The sight brought an unexpected calm to her aching heart. She whispered to herself, "Maybe this is where I'll begin again." Margaret's first steps onto the tarmac were met with the warmth of the coastal breeze. The salty air carried hints of eucalyptus and citrus, enveloping her like a gentle embrace. She had booked a modest but charming inn just outside the city, nestled among rows of vineyards that rolled across the hills like a green patchwork quilt. When she arrived, the innkeeper, a kind woman with silver hair and a warm smile, showed her to her room. It was simple yet elegant, with a balcony overlooking the vineyard. That evening, Margaret stepped out onto the balcony, a glass of chilled white wine in hand. Below, the rows of vines glowed softly in the twilight, their symmetry a soothing balm to her fractured emotions. In the distance, the sound of a guitar drifted through the air, a soulful melody played by someone unseen. Margaret closed her eyes and let the music wrap around her, each note unraveling a piece of the tension knotted in her chest. The next morning, Margaret ventured into the bustling town square of Santa Barbara. Colorful stalls lined the streets, offering everything from handmade jewelry to fresh produce. Margaret found herself drawn to a stall selling intricate seashell carvings. As her fingers grazed the smooth surface of a particularly beautiful conch, she heard a familiar deep voice. "Planning to claim that one, too?" Startled, Margaret looked up to see a man standing beside her, his teasing smile revealing a hint of dimples. His sun-kissed skin and slightly disheveled dark hair gave him a rugged charm. But it was his eyes, an intense blue like the ocean she had just flown over, that caught her attention. Sorry, what?" she stammered. He chuckled softly. "You seem as mesmerized by it as I am," he said, gesturing toward the shell. "But I'm willing to negotiate." Margaret smiled despite herself, momentarily disarmed. "Negotiate? For a seashell?" "It's not just any seashell," he replied, holding it up so the sunlight illuminated the intricate carvings. "It's a masterpiece, and I believe fate brought us both here to claim it." Margaret tilted her head, studying him with amusement. "Are you always this dramatic?" "Only when I'm fighting for treasure," he said with mock seriousness. "But I'll make you a deal. You take the shell, and I'll take your name." Margaret laughed, a genuine, light-hearted sound that surprised even herself. For the first time in days, the weight on her heart lifted, if only for a moment. "Margaret," she said, extending her hand. "And you?" "Daniel," he replied, shaking her hand warmly. "Daniel Pierce." Their brief encounter lingered with Margaret as she explored the town. Something about Daniel's easy charm and genuine warmth stayed with her, like a melody she couldn't quite forget. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she found herself back at the inn, watching the amber light fade into indigo. A knock at her door startled her. When she opened it, she found a small note tucked into the doorframe. It read, "Dinner at the bistro by the pier?" "Daniel." Margaret hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. She wasn't sure she was ready for anything beyond solitude, but the thought of sitting across from someone who had already made her laugh once was undeniably appealing. Margaret stood in the doorway for a long moment, the note from Daniel between her fingers. The bistro by the pier. The image evoked soft waves lapping against wooden pilings, the hum of quiet conversation, and the warmth of string lights swaying in the breeze. It sounded peaceful, inviting. But then doubt crept in. Is it too soon? She wondered. Am I ready to share a part of myself with someone again? She set the note on the desk and turned toward the balcony, letting the ocean breeze cool her flushed cheeks. As she gazed out at the horizon, the golden light of the setting sun mirrored her own inner struggle, caught between holding on to her grief and reaching for the faint glimmer of possibility. With a steadying breath, Margaret made her decision. Pulling a soft, flowy white dress from her suitcase, she prepared for the evening. She kept her look simple, her loose waves framing her face naturally. When she finally stepped out of her room, she felt a mix of nervous energy and excitement, a feeling she hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime. The bistro was everything Margaret imagined it to be. Nestled right on the edge of the pier, it exuded a cozy charm with its flickering lanterns and the gentle sound of waves just below. Daniel was waiting near the entrance, dressed casually in a crisp navy shirt and khaki pants that somehow made him look effortlessly sophisticated. When he saw her, his smile widened, and for a moment Margaret felt the unease in her chest loosen. "I was starting to think you wouldn't come," he said, his voice warm and teasing. "I almost didn't," Margaret admitted, returning his smile. "But this place is hard to resist." "Good, because the food is even harder to resist," Daniel replied, gesturing toward the bistro. "Shall we?" Inside, they were seated at a small table by the window, the perfect vantage point for watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was awash with colors, deep orange fading to lavender, and then indigo. Margaret found herself relaxing, the beauty of the setting melting away her initial nerves. They ordered fresh seafood, and as the conversation flowed, Margaret discovered that Daniel was both easy to talk to and genuinely curious about her. He shared stories about his work as a marine biologist, his love for the ocean evident in every word. Margaret listened, captivated by his passion. When the food arrived, their conversation turned more personal. Margaret hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about her recent heartbreak. But as Daniel spoke about his own life, his struggles with balancing career and family expectations, she realized there was no pressure to share everything at once. He seemed content to simply enjoy her company. As the evening wore on, their laughter became more frequent, their connection undeniable. Margaret found herself sharing little pieces of her story, a childhood memory of summers spent by the lake, her love for painting, even her favorite guilty pleasure TV show. Daniel listened attentively, his eyes never leaving hers. At one point, a breeze carried the faint sound of a street musician playing a violin nearby. Daniel's face lit up. "Do you hear that?" he asked, leaning closer. Margaret nodded, smiling. "It's beautiful." "Come on," he said, rising from his seat and extending a hand. "Let's go listen." Surprised but intrigued, Margaret placed her hand in his and he led her outside. The music grew louder as they walked along the pier, and soon they found the source, a young violinist performing a soulful melody under a string of lights. A small crowd had gathered, swaying gently to the rhythm. Without warning, Daniel turned to Margaret and asked, "May I have this dance?" Margaret blinked, caught off guard. "Here? Now?" "Why not?" Daniel replied, his smile playful but sincere. "The moment feels right." Margaret hesitated only a second longer before nodding. He took her hands, and they began to sway to the music. Around them, the world seemed to blur, the sounds of the ocean and the laughter of strangers fading into the background. It was just the two of them, moving in unison under the soft glow of the lights. For the first time since leaving Charleston, Margaret felt truly present. There was no past weighing her down, no future to worry about, only this fleeting, beautiful moment. As the night came to an end, Daniel walked Margaret back to her inn. The stars overhead were bright and clear, their brilliance mirrored in the quiet joy she felt. When they reached her door, Daniel hesitated, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad you came tonight," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. "It was nice getting to know you." "Thank you for inviting me," Margaret replied, her cheeks warming under his gaze. "I needed this more than I realized." Daniel nodded, stepping back with a small, almost reluctant smile. "Good night, Margaret." "Good night, Daniel," she said, watching, as he turned and disappeared down the path. Closing the door behind her, Margaret leaned against it, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in weeks, the ache in her chest felt lighter, as though her heart was finally beginning to heal. The morning sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of Margaret's room, bathing it in a soft golden glow. She stretched lazily, savoring the rare sensation of waking up without a knot of sadness in her chest. The previous evening had been surprising. Daniel's presence had been a balm for her spirit, his warmth and humor providing a glimpse of what moving forward might feel like. Margaret rose and stepped out onto the balcony, the vineyard below stretching toward the horizon. With her coffee in hand, she let the calm of the scene seep into her. It wasn't just the beauty of the place. It was the sense of possibility that came with being somewhere new, where no one knew her story unless she chose to share it. Her phone buzzed on the small table beside her. She hesitated before picking it up, knowing it could bring news from Charleston. Sure enough, there was a text from her best friend, Claire. "Thinking of you. Call me if you need anything." Margaret's heart softened. Claire had been her rock through the whirlwind of emotions surrounding the wedding that wasn't. Deciding she didn't want to avoid the world entirely, Margaret typed a quick reply. "Thanks, Claire. I'm okay. Just taking some time to breathe." She didn't mention Daniel. That part of her new beginning still felt too fresh, too fragile to share. Later that afternoon, Margaret found herself wandering through a local farmer's market in Santa Barbara. The vibrant stalls overflowed with ripe fruits, handmade crafts, and fresh-cut flowers. The air buzzed with the sounds of cheerful vendors and casual chatter. Margaret was admiring a stall filled with lavender-scented candles when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Should I be concerned that you're stalking me?" She turned, startled, to find Daniel standing there with a basket of fresh produce in one hand and that same mischievous grin on his face. His presence was as easy and natural as the sea breeze, and Margaret couldn't help but smile. "Stalking you? I think you're projecting," she countered, gesturing toward his basket. "Besides, it looks like you're the one who's been busy." Daniel glanced at the basket, then shrugged. "A man's got to eat. Though I'm regretting not inviting you to help with these choices. You seem like you'd have good taste." Margaret rolled her eyes playfully. "You know nothing about my taste." Daniel leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "True, but I'm willing to find out." Before she could reply, a little girl darted between them, chasing a brightly colored balloon. Margaret laughed as Daniel stepped aside to let her pass, his eyes sparkling. It was a small moment, but one that reminded her how refreshing his energy was, a stark contrast to the heavy air of her life back in Charleston. As they strolled through the market together, Daniel turned to her with a sudden thought. "I know this is last minute, but I'm going out on the water tomorrow, a little kayaking, maybe some snorkeling. You're welcome to join." Margaret blinked, surprised by the invitation. "You don't think I'll slow you down?" Daniel smirked. "I think you might surprise me. Besides, I promise not to judge if you're terrible at paddling." She laughed, feeling a flicker of excitement. The thought of being on the water, surrounded by the vastness of the ocean, felt like the perfect antidote to the closed chapters of her recent past. "Okay," she said, nodding. "I'll go." The next morning, Margaret met Daniel at the marina. The sun was already warming the docks, casting golden reflections on the gentle waves. Daniel greeted her with a grin, offering her a life vest and a bright orange kayak. As they paddled out into the open water, Margaret felt the tension in her shoulders melt away. The rhythm of the oars cutting through the water was soothing, and the expanse of the ocean around them gave her a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. They reached a quiet cove where the water was so clear she could see fish darting between the coral below. Daniel handed her a snorkeling mask and gestured toward the edge of his kayak. "Ready to dive in?" Margaret hesitated, the thought of plunging into the unknown both thrilling and daunting. But when she looked at Daniel, his expression one of quiet encouragement. She took a deep breath and nodded. The water was cool against her skin, and as she submerged, a world of color and life unfolded before her. Schools of fish glided by in shimmering patterns, their movements like a living mosaic. Margaret felt a surge of wonder, the beauty of the underwater world momentarily washing away all her lingering doubts. When she surfaced, Daniel was watching her, his smile wide. "See? You're a natural." Margaret laughed, pushing her wet hair out of her face. "I don't know about that, but this is amazing." As they floated together, the gentle waves rocking their kayaks, Margaret realized something profound. She was beginning to feel like herself again. Not the Margaret defined by a broken engagement or years of carefully constructed plans, but the Margaret who could embrace the unexpected and find joy in the simple beauty of the present. The innocent remark of the children broke the ice instantly. The man, who exuded both elegance and ease in his white linen shirt, chuckled warmly as he approached Margaret's table, with the children flanking him on either side. "Sorry for the interruption," he said with a disarming smile, his deep voice carrying a lilt of humor. "It seems my kids are much better at socializing than I am." Margaret laughed softly, setting aside her initial hesitation. The children, brimming with energy and sweetness, gazed at her with wide, admiring eyes, making her feel instantly at ease. "Don't worry about it," she replied, her green eyes sparkling with amusement. "They're delightful." The man's smile widened, his eyes crinkling at the corners. There was something genuine about his presence, a warmth that felt magnetic yet unassuming. "How rude of me," he continued, stepping closer. "My name is Andrew Victor Morelli, originally from Boston, but I've been living here in Key West for the last 5 years." Andrew paused briefly, then added with a slight tilt of his head, his tone lowering to one of casual charm, "It's rare to meet someone whose beauty is so utterly captivating." Though flattered, Margaret raised an eyebrow, a playful smirk tugging at her lips. "Thank you," she replied, her voice carrying both grace and subtle skepticism. "But honestly, I don't place much faith in compliments. They often come too easily, don't they? I prefer words that come straight from the heart, even if they aren't quite as polished." Andrew's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise and admiration passing over his face. "Then allow me to speak from my heart," he said earnestly. "You're radiant, Margaret, not just in the way the world sees beauty, but because there's a light in your eyes, something rare and extraordinary. It's the kind of light only those who've endured darkness can possess." Margaret paused, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. Just then, the children, growing impatient with the adult exchange, chimed in to reintroduce themselves. "I'm Ethan," announced one of the boys, his small hand shooting up enthusiastically. "And I'm Max," added the other with a shy smile. Margaret knelt slightly to meet their gaze, her warm demeanor softening further. "It's lovely to meet you both, Ethan and Max," she said with genuine affection, ruffling Max's hair lightly. Andrew watched the exchange with a mix of curiosity and admiration. After a brief pause, he gestured to the empty chairs across from Margaret. "Are you here alone?" he asked gently, his tone kind and unassuming. "If you don't mind, maybe my boys and I could join you?" Margaret considered his request, her smile both gracious and confident. "I suppose I'm not entirely alone," she said, a playful glint in her eyes. "I have my own delightful company, but it would be a pleasure to share my table with you, Andrew, Ethan, and Max." Andrew appeared genuinely taken aback by her poised response, her mix of humor and sincerity catching him off guard. With a warm nod, he pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his boys quickly settling in on either side of him. The gentle ocean breeze seemed to carry the promise of something unexpected, as if the quiet Caribbean evening had become the backdrop to an unfolding story. After a few minutes of light conversation, Andrew turned to Margaret with an unexpectedly direct question. His tone was calm but thoughtful, his eyes searching hers. "Forgive me if I'm being presumptuous, but there's something in your expression, a shadow perhaps, that makes me wonder, are you carrying a silent pain?" Margaret hesitated, her fingers tracing the brim of her wine-glass. "It's curious you'd ask that," she said after a moment, her voice steady but distant. "Just days ago, I thought love was sacred, a promise built together. But I was wrong." She paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. On the day of my wedding, I discovered that my fiancé had betrayed me. Since then, I've stopped believing in love entirely. Andrew listened intently, his features softening as he absorbed her words. To Margaret's surprise, he chuckled, not dismissively, but with a kind of understanding that caught her off guard. "Welcome to the club," he said, his smile wry. "I suppose that makes two of us." Margaret tilted her head, intrigued by his response. "And why do you say that?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Andrew leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "I came to Key West 5 years ago, needing a fresh start. A year later, I fell deeply in love with someone. We had a whirlwind romance, and not long after, she became pregnant. But shortly after our twins were born, she fell for someone else, a foreigner. She left to build a new life with him in Paris." He glanced down at his hands before continuing. "Since then, it's just been me and the boys, and I've stopped hoping for anything more. When you expect nothing, nothing can disappoint you." Margaret watched him quietly, sensing the depth of his pain beneath his calm exterior. After a moment, she raised her glass, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Then, let's toast to that, Andrew, to not believing in love." They clinked glasses, their shared disillusionment weaving an unspoken bond between them. Ethan and Max, oblivious to the seriousness of the moment, began making funny faces at one another, drawing laughter from both adults. As the night wore on, the heaviness in the air gave way to a surprising lightness. The children's laughter became contagious, and each story shared between Margaret and Andrew seemed to chip away at the walls they had built around their hearts. The Caribbean sun bathed Key West in its warm embrace as Margaret stirred in her room the next morning. She stretched languidly, her mind drifting back to the night before. The dinner with Andrew and his children had been unexpectedly joyful. It wasn't just their charming company, it was the way Andrew had understood her without prying, the way the children's laughter had momentarily lifted the weight in her chest. She dressed with her usual effortless elegance, white linen pants that hugged her slender frame and a navy blouse tied neatly at the waist. Her gold hoop earrings caught the light as she applied her jasmine-scented perfume, the fragrance both familiar and grounding. As she slipped on her heeled sandals, she glanced in the mirror, noting how her green eyes seemed a little brighter today. The market buzzed with life as Margaret walked through its vibrant stalls, her heels clicking against the cobblestones. Fresh flowers, vivid produce, and the hum of friendly negotiations surrounded her, creating a lively atmosphere. She approached a stand overflowing with strawberries, her favorite fruit. Leaning closer, she inspected the plump red berries, her hands hesitating as she searched for the perfect ones. An elderly vendor, her wrinkled hand steady as she sorted the berries, noticed Margaret's dilemma and leaned closer. "Dear," she said, her voice soft and wise, "don't spend too much time searching for perfection. The sweetest ones often have small flaws. Life isn't about appearances, it's about the flavor that stays with you." Margaret paused, taking in the woman's words. A gentle smile crept onto her lips as she nodded her thanks. Just as she handed over her money, a voice, sharp and familiar, cut through the air. "Well, isn't this quaint?" came the drawl. Margaret turned to see a striking woman with dark hair and a haughty expression inspecting the same strawberries. Typical of a place like this, not a single thing worth my time. The woman's eyes flicked to Margaret with a faint sneer. "But I suppose some people see charm in mediocrity." Margaret felt her stomach tighten, but instead of backing down, she straightened her posture, her tone firm but composed. "Perhaps it's not the place that's lacking," she replied evenly. "Maybe it's the perspective of those looking at it." The woman's lips curled into a thin smile, her eyes narrowing briefly before she turned back to the vendor. Margaret picked up her strawberries and started to leave, her heels clicking rhythmically as she walked away. As Margaret navigated the cobblestone streets, her heel suddenly caught on an uneven stone. She wobbled, her balance faltering, and in a split second she braced for an inevitable fall. But strong arms caught her, steadying her before she hit the ground. Startled, Margaret looked up and met Andrew's piercing blue eyes. "Got you," he said softly, his hands still resting lightly on her arms. Their faces were close enough that Margaret could feel the warmth of his breath and see the faint stubble on his jawline. "Thank you," she murmured, her cheeks warming under his gaze. Before either of them could speak again, two familiar voices rang out. "Margaret!" Ethan and Max came bounding over, their faces alight with excitement, as they wrapped their small arms around her legs. "Hello, boys," Margaret said, crouching to hug them. She glanced at Andrew, who was watching the interaction, with a faint smile. Noticing her broken heel, Margaret slipped off her shoes and held them in her hand. "I guess I'll have to manage without these," she said, with a wry smile. Andrew's expression turned thoughtful. "Maybe that's the universe's way of telling you to walk a little closer to the earth," he teased gently. Margaret laughed, but the moment was interrupted when the woman from the market approached. Without hesitation, she looped her arm around Andrew's, pressing a kiss to his cheek that left a bold mark of red lipstick. "Andrew," she cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I've been looking everywhere for you." Margaret felt a jolt of unease ripple through her, though she kept her composure. "I should be going," she said, her tone light but clipped. Andrew stepped forward, his brow furrowing. "Wait, Margaret, let me introduce you. This is Lauren. She's my son's nanny." Lauren's smile didn't reach her eyes as she looked Margaret up and down. "Ah, so you're the new friend." Margaret met her gaze calmly. "And you must be the nanny," she replied, her words deliberate but not unkind. Andrew, sensing the tension, gestured toward his car, a sleek black Mercedes parked nearby. "Margaret, let me at least give you a ride back. You can't walk barefoot through these streets." Lauren's expression soured, but Margaret hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Thank you." The ride to Margaret's villa was quiet, punctuated only by Ethan and Max's cheerful chatter from the back seat. Lauren sat stiffly beside them, her sharp gaze darting between Margaret and Andrew. As they neared the villa, Andrew broke the silence. "Margaret, I was planning to cook tonight. Something simple, just pasta. Why don't you join us? The boys would love to have you, and I promise I make a mean marinara sauce." Margaret glanced at him, surprised by the invitation. Before she could answer, Lauren interjected. "I'm sure Margaret has plans," she said smoothly. "Besides, Andrew, you know how particular the boys are about routine." Andrew's jaw tightened slightly, but his tone remained pleasant. "Actually, I think the boys could use a little excitement." Turning to Margaret, he added, "What do you say?" Margaret hesitated, glancing back at the boys whose faces were filled with hopeful anticipation. Finally, she smiled. "I'd love to." The sleek Mercedes glided through the streets of Key West before pulling into the long driveway of Andrew's villa. Nestled against the backdrop of the ocean, the house was both modern and inviting, with clean lines and expansive glass windows that reflected the setting sun. As the car came to a stop, Ethan and Max jumped out eagerly, their laughter echoing across the driveway as they ran toward the front door. Margaret stepped out gracefully, her bare feet touching the cool stone path. Andrew circled around the car and gestured toward the villa. "Welcome to my home," he said with a smile, his tone warm but laced with a touch of nervousness. Lauren followed closely, her posture rigid. She clutched her handbag tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line as she shot a glance at Margaret, who walked beside Andrew. The tension between the two women lingered in the air, palpable yet unspoken. Inside, the villa was breathtaking. The living area featured high ceilings and a seamless view of the ocean, thanks to floor-to-ceiling windows. The decor was minimalist but elegant, with neutral tones that allowed the vibrant hues of the Caribbean sunset to dominate. Margaret admired a large abstract painting above the fireplace, its bold strokes reminiscent of crashing waves. "This is stunning," she said softly, her eyes lingering on the view outside. Andrew smiled as he led her to the kitchen. "Thank you. I've always believed a home should feel like a retreat, open, calming, and connected to the sea." Margaret nodded, taking in the space. The kitchen was equally impressive, with polished marble countertops, sleek stainless steel appliances, and an oversized island in the center. Lauren lingered by the doorway, her presence casting a faint shadow over the otherwise warm atmosphere. Andrew rolled up his sleeves and began preparing the ingredients for dinner. "It's nothing fancy," he said, his hands deftly chopping garlic and fresh basil. "Just a simple marinara sauce with spaghetti, but I promise it's a family favorite." Margaret, intrigued, stepped closer. "Mind if I help?" she asked. Andrew paused, looking pleasantly surprised. "Not at all. I could use a sous chef." Margaret smiled and reached for an apron, tying it neatly around her waist. She scanned the counter, spotting a container of sun-dried tomatoes. "What if we add these?" she suggested, holding them up. Andrew raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a half smile. "Sun-dried tomatoes and marinara? That's bold," Margaret shrugged playfully. "Sometimes a little twist makes all the difference." Andrew chuckled, nodding. "Let's give it a shot." As they worked side by side, the tension in the room began to ease. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, punctuated by laughter, as Margaret teased Andrew about his less-than-perfect dicing skills. Even Ethan and Max joined in, climbing onto stools at the island to watch. Lauren, however, remained silent, her sharp eyes darting between Andrew and Margaret. Her grip on her handbag tightened with each shared laugh, her frustration simmering just below the surface. By the time dinner was ready, the aroma of garlic, basil, and tomatoes filled the villa. The table was set in the dining room, which opened onto a spacious deck overlooking the ocean. The boys eagerly carried plates to the table, their excitement infectious. Andrew poured glasses of wine for himself and Margaret, while Lauren served herself with a practiced air of detachment. She took a small sip of wine, her expression carefully neutral as she observed the others. "This smells amazing," Margaret said, twirling her fork into the perfectly cooked spaghetti. She took a bite, her eyes widening in delight. "And it tastes even better," Andrew grinned. "I'll admit, the sun-dried tomatoes were a great addition." Ethan and Max nodded enthusiastically, their mouths full of pasta. "It's so good," Ethan declared, his voice muffled. Lauren, however, set down her fork with deliberate slowness. "It's different," she said, her tone carrying a faint edge of disapproval. "Perhaps a bit unconventional for the boys' tastes." Margaret looked up, her expression polite but firm. "Sometimes it's good to try something new, don't you think?" Lauren met her gaze, her smile tight. "Of course. But children thrive on consistency. It's important not to disrupt their routines." Andrew, sensing the growing tension, intervened smoothly. "I think the boys are doing just fine. Besides, it's nice to shake things up once in a while." Margaret smiled at him gratefully, while Lauren's expression darkened. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere became lighter, thanks to Ethan and Max's boundless energy. They regaled Margaret with stories about their adventures at school and their love for the ocean. Their laughter was infectious, and soon the entire table was smiling, except for Lauren, whose mood remained sour. After dinner, Andrew suggested moving to the deck to enjoy the cool evening breeze. The children ran ahead, their excited voices echoing into the night. Andrew brought out a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, gesturing for Margaret to join him. Lauren, however, lingered. "Shall I put the boys to bed?" she asked, her voice clipped. Andrew hesitated. "Actually, I think they'll be fine on their own for a bit. Thanks, Lauren." Lauren's eyes flicked to Margaret, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Of course," she said, her tone betraying her irritation. She turned on her heel and disappeared into the house. On the deck, the night was calm. The sound of waves gently lapping against the shore filled the silence as Andrew poured wine for Margaret. They sat side by side, the soft glow of lanterns illuminating their faces. "This feels peaceful," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've always found the ocean to be grounding. No matter what's happening in life, the waves keep coming, steady and unwavering." Margaret studied him for a moment. "Do you ever feel like it's too late to start over?" Andrew turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I used to. After my ex left, I convinced myself I'd never let anyone get close again. But then—" He paused, his voice faltering. "Sometimes life surprises you." Margaret's heart fluttered at the sincerity in his words. She opened her mouth to reply, but Ethan's voice interrupted them. "Dad, Margaret, come see the stars." Andrew smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Duty calls." Margaret laughed softly as they stood and joined the boys, who were lying on the deck pointing at the sky. As she looked up at the vast expanse of stars, Margaret felt something stir deep within her, a quiet, tentative hope. The night sky over Key West was a canvas of constellations, each star shimmering like a tiny beacon of possibility. Ethan and Max lay sprawled on the wooden deck, their small fingers tracing imaginary lines between the stars as they chatted excitedly. "That one looks like a rocket ship," Ethan exclaimed, his voice brimming with awe. "No, it's a dolphin," Max countered, squinting as he tried to see the shapes his brother described. Margaret knelt between the boys, her laughter soft and genuine. "You're both right," she said, pointing at a cluster of stars. "That could be a dolphin riding a rocket ship." The boys erupted into giggles, their joy infectious. Andrew watched from a few steps away, leaning against the railing with a glass of wine in his hand. His gaze shifted from the stars to Margaret, his expression contemplative. For a moment he allowed himself to marvel at how easily she had fit into their evening, her warmth and humor lighting up the space around her. Margaret glanced up, catching his eyes. "What?" she asked, her tone teasing but curious. Andrew shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Nothing, just thinking that the boys might have a new favorite person." Margaret's cheeks flushed, though she kept her voice light. "Well, I'm honored. They're pretty special themselves." Ethan tugged at Margaret's sleeve, drawing her attention back. "Can we go to the beach tomorrow?" he asked, his face eager. Max chimed in. "Please, Margaret, you have to come with us." Margaret hesitated, glancing at Andrew for his reaction. He nodded encouragingly. "We'd love for you to join us," he said. "The boys have been begging for a beach day, and I think it's long overdue." Margaret smiled softly. "All right, I'd love to. But only if you promise not to laugh if I'm terrible at building sand castles." The boys cheered, and Andrew chuckled. "You might regret that. These two are pretty competitive." As the night wound down, Margaret prepared to leave. She stepped back into the villa to collect her things where she found Lauren lingering near the kitchen island. The nanny's posture was stiff, her arms crossed as she regarded Margaret with thinly veiled disdain. "Heading out so soon?" Lauren asked, her tone laced with feigned politeness. Margaret offered a polite smile. "It's getting late, and I don't want to overstay my welcome." Lauren stepped closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're quite the hit with the boys," she remarked, her voice dropping. "But you should know, Andrew is very protective of his children. He doesn't let just anyone into their lives." Margaret held her ground, her expression calm but unwavering. "That's a good quality in a father," she replied evenly. "I think it's clear how much Andrew cares about them." Lauren's smile tightened, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the edge beneath her words. "Yes, and as someone who's been with this family for years, I can tell you that stability is what they need, not fleeting distractions." Before Margaret could respond, Andrew entered the room, breaking the tension. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, his eyes darting between the two women. Margaret turned to him with a reassuring smile. "Yes, I was just about to thank you for a lovely evening." Andrew's gaze softened. "It was our pleasure. Let me walk you out." Lauren watched silently as Andrew escorted Margaret to the door, her knuckles white as she gripped the counter. Her frustration simmered beneath the surface, her mind already working on how to reclaim the control she felt slipping away. The next morning, Margaret joined Andrew and the boys at a secluded stretch of beach. The sun was warm, and the gentle sound of waves provided a serene backdrop. Ethan and Max immediately began building an elaborate sand castle, their determination evident as they worked side by side. Margaret knelt beside them, her fingers digging into the soft sand as she helped shape the castle's towers. Andrew stood nearby, his hands on his hips as he admired their progress. "Not bad," he teased, "but I think it needs a moat." Margaret raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Oh, you think so? Care to join us and show off your engineering skills?" Andrew laughed, dropping to his knees to help. Together the four of them worked on the castle, their laughter ringing out as they debated its design. For a few hours, Margaret felt completely at ease, the weight of her recent heartbreak momentarily forgotten. After lunch, Margaret wandered toward the shoreline, her feet sinking into the wet sand as the waves lapped at her ankles. Andrew joined her, his expression thoughtful, as they gazed out at the horizon. "Thank you for today," Margaret said softly, her voice carrying over the sound of the waves. "It's been a long time since I've felt this light." Andrew looked at her, his blue eyes filled with an intensity that made her heart skip. "You bring something special to our lives, Margaret. I don't think you realize how much." Margaret turned away, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, but the scars of her past made it hard to trust the possibility of something real. Back at the villa, Lauren watched from a window as Margaret and Andrew returned from the beach with the boys. The sight of them laughing together stirred a fresh wave of anger in her chest. She had spent years cultivating her position in Andrew's life, and the arrival of Margaret threatened everything she had worked for. Determined to drive a wedge between them, Lauren decided to act. That evening, as Andrew reviewed work emails in his study, Lauren knocked softly on the door. "Andrew, can I talk to you for a moment?" she asked, her tone unusually sweet. Andrew looked up, setting his laptop aside. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Lauren hesitated, feigning reluctance. "It's about Margaret. I couldn't help but notice how much time she's been spending with the boys. I just hope you're being cautious. The boys have been through so much already, and I'd hate to see them get attached to someone who might not stay." Andrew's brow furrowed, but he remained calm. "I appreciate your concern, Lauren, but Margaret has been wonderful with the boys. They're happy, and that's what matters." Lauren pressed on, her tone soft but insistent. "I understand, but don't you think it's a bit soon? You've always been so careful about protecting their stability." Andrew's expression hardened slightly. "Lauren, I trust my instincts when it comes to my family. Margaret is a positive presence in our lives, and I'm not going to question that." Realizing she had overstepped, Lauren quickly backpedaled. "Of course, I didn't mean to imply otherwise. I just wanted to look out for you." Andrew nodded, his focus returning to his laptop. But as Lauren left the study, a flicker of doubt lingered in his mind, her words echoing faintly. Lauren's words lingered in Andrew's mind longer than he wanted to admit. That night, after putting the boys to bed, he sat on the deck, the gentle sound of waves failing to calm his restless thoughts. Margaret had brought joy back into their lives, something he hadn't realized was missing until she appeared. But Lauren's insinuations gnawed at him. Was he being selfish, allowing himself to believe in the possibility of something more while risking the boys' emotional stability? Meanwhile, Margaret sat in her villa, staring at her phone. She hadn't heard from Andrew since their beach day, and while she told herself it didn't matter, a flicker of insecurity crept in. Her mind replayed Lauren's veiled barbs, each one a subtle reminder that she didn't belong in Andrew's world. The following morning, Andrew resolved to seek clarity. He needed to speak with Margaret to understand where they stood. He called her, relieved when she answered on the second ring. "Margaret," he began, his voice steady but hesitant, "can we meet? There's something I need to talk to you about." Margaret's heart skipped, uncertainty swirling in her chest. "Of course," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "Where should we meet?" "There's a quiet cafe near the marina," Andrew suggested. "How about noon?" Margaret agreed, her mind racing as she prepared for the meeting. The cafe was charming, with outdoor seating, shaded by large umbrellas, and a view of the boats gently bobbing in the water. Margaret arrived first, her crisp white dress fluttering in the breeze as she took a seat near the edge of the patio. She ordered a coffee, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of the cup as she waited. When Andrew arrived, he looked uncharacteristically tense, his usual easy demeanor replaced by a guarded expression. He sat across from her, his blue eyes searching hers. "Margaret," he began after a moment, "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what's happening between us." Margaret felt her throat tighten, but she nodded, urging him to continue. "You've brought something into my life that I didn't think was possible," Andrew admitted, his voice soft. "Happiness, hope. But I need to ask, what do you want from this? From me?" Margaret blinked, caught off guard by the question. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "Andrew, I didn't come here looking for anything. You and the boys. You just happened. And it's been wonderful. But if you're asking me to make promises, I can't do that. I don't know what the future holds." Andrew nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "That's fair. After what happened with their mother, I'm cautious, not just for me, but for Ethan and Max. I don't want them to get hurt." Margaret looked down, her chest aching. "I understand. And I'd never want to hurt them. But I think we both know this isn't just about the boys." Andrew's eyes widened slightly, surprised by her directness. Margaret leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "You're scared, Andrew, of letting someone in again. And I can't blame you. I'm scared too. But if we keep holding back, we'll never know what this could be." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Andrew looked at her, his expression conflicted. Finally, he reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "You're right," he said quietly. "I am scared. But I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." As Andrew and Margaret began to navigate their burgeoning relationship, Lauren's resentment grew. She couldn't stand watching Margaret slip so easily into the life she had envisioned for herself. Driven by jealousy, she decided to make one last attempt to sabotage them. That evening, as Andrew was helping the boys with their homework, Lauren approached him. She carried an envelope, her expression somber. "I found this," she said, handing it to him. "I thought you should see it." Andrew frowned, opening the envelope to find a series of photographs. They showed Margaret speaking with a man in town, a man who appeared to be handing her money. Lauren's voice was low and measured as she said, "I didn't want to believe it, but I thought you should know. It looks like she might be taking advantage of your generosity." Andrew's expression darkened, and for a moment Lauren thought she had succeeded. But then he set the photos down and looked at her sharply. "Lauren, I know Margaret, and I trust her. Whatever this is, it's not what you're trying to make it seem." Lauren faltered, her confidence slipping. "Andrew, I'm just looking out for you." "No," he interrupted, his tone firm. "You're trying to drive her away, and it ends now. I appreciate everything you've done for the boys, but I won't let you interfere in my personal life any longer." Lauren stared at him, stunned. Without another word, she turned and left the room, her plans unraveling before her. The following weekend, Andrew invited Margaret and the boys to a family picnic by the beach. The atmosphere was light and carefree, with Ethan and Max running in and out of the waves, while Margaret and Andrew prepared sandwiches. As the sun began to set, Andrew turned to Margaret, his expression serious but warm. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about taking a chance." Margaret looked at him, her heart racing. "And?" Andrew reached for her hand, his voice steady. "I want to try, with you, for us, and for the boys." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she nodded. "I want that, too." Over the months that followed, Margaret and Andrew built a life together, filled with laughter, challenges, and love. Lauren moved on, her presence replaced by someone who truly cared for the boys. Ethan and Max flourished under the warmth of their blended family, and Margaret found herself healing in ways she never thought possible. One evening, as the four of them walked along the beach, Andrew stopped and knelt in the sand, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Margaret's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple but stunning diamond ring. "Margaret," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "you've brought light and love back into our lives. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." As Andrew slipped the ring onto her finger, Ethan and Max cheered, their excitement echoing across the shore. Under the stars, with the waves crashing gently at their feet, Margaret realized that love, real, imperfect, and beautiful, had found her again. Because sometimes the sweetest things in life are the ones we never see coming.